record. Exciting. Welcome everyone. It is April 1st, an April Fool's Day where I don't think many of us will be pulling many tricks because it's been a crazy ride the past couple of weeks. And we are here at 12 noon with the next of our Lunch and Learn pop-ups. Today we're very lucky to have Matt Kures speaking to us about some of the potential impacts of COVID-19 on the tourism and service economy. I'll have everyone muted while Matt's talking, but you'll have the ability to unmute yourself and ask a question. We generally keep this pretty casual, so if you do have a question, feel free to just throw it out there. If you don't feel comfortable asking the question, or if your microphone or your connection falters a little bit, I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat room, and I'll voice your question for you if for some reason you're not comfortable or able to do it on your own. So with that, Matt, take it away.
Great, thank you everyone. We have the tornado test sirens going off in the background right now as it's 12 noon on a Wednesday, the first of the month. So if anyone hears that, I apologize. I'm just going to try and share my screen here. Can you enable screen sharing, Kristen?
I can.
All right.
Let me see. In theory, I can.
All right, we'll see.
All right, here we go. Where we have now reached the limits of what I know how to do.
Still says it's disabled.
Disabled, okay. Okay, are you able to now?
Give it a shot. Yep, okay. There we go. Thank you.
There we go. Perfect.
Great. Okay, we look good?
We look great.
All right. So I know everyone has a lot of questions about how this pandemic's affecting our economy. And to be honest, we don't have a lot of really good answers yet because this is unlike anything we've ever faced before, in modern times anyway. But one of the things I wanted to do was try and look at some of the kind of initial impacts on the tourism and service economy in the state based on some of Governor Evers' early business closures and social distancing measures. So what I did was to try and look at how it might influence two broad industry sectors in our economy. The first one being arts, entertainment, and recreation, which is NAICS 71. That includes performing arts, spectator sports, related industries. So anything from the Milwaukee Brewers and the Wisconsin Badgers to entertainment facilities like music venues and so on and so forth. A lot of independent artists, writers, and performers. This group accounts for just over 10,000 employees in the state of Wisconsin. It also includes museums, historical sites, and some more institutions. So also including things like zoos and botanical gardens. And then the biggest part of that subsector, which is amusement, gambling, and recreation industries, which is almost just over 37,000 employees in the state. So casinos, golf courses, even there's been some discussion about possibly reopening those, ski resorts, our health clubs are included there, and bowling centers. And then we also have the accommodation and food service category, which is obviously accommodations such as hotels, bed and breakfast, RV parks, which is about 33,000 employees in the state. And then the biggest one, which is food services and drinking places, which is almost 209,000 employees in the state of Wisconsin. And if we look at how these industries compare relative to national averages in terms of employment, for instance, we can see that both of these industries in the state of Wisconsin have a slightly smaller share of total employment compared to the United States averages. But we do see accommodation and food services accounts for about 8% of total employment in the state of Wisconsin, which is the fourth biggest subsector in the state. Arts, entertainment, and recreation is a bit smaller at 1.4%, but nonetheless is bigger than some other significant sectors in terms of total employment in the state of Wisconsin. If we look at it in terms of salaries and wages, we see a bit difference here, and that's due to the fact that a lot of these occupations found in these industries tend to be lower paying, primarily due to their part-time nature. But nonetheless, we see that accommodation and food services accounts for about 3% of total wages in the state of Wisconsin, and about 1% of total wages for arts, entertainment, and recreation. And again, here we see the dominance of the manufacturing sector in the state, healthcare and social assistance, and government enterprises. Another perspective is contributions to total gross domestic product. And again, the smaller shares we see here for accommodation and food services reflect that they are lower wage. They don't have as high value added as industry sectors like manufacturing. But nonetheless, combined contribute about 3% of the state's total GDP. Now, one area where they do contribute a lot of economic impact is in terms of sales and use taxes. We can see that even though accommodation and food services didn't account for much in terms of GDP or much in terms of total wages as a state share, we can see that accommodation and food services accounts for over 10% of all sales and use tax in the state of Wisconsin in 2019. Obviously, the biggest is being retail trade. How that sector is impacted going forward, we can discuss at the end of the presentation. Then we also see arts, entertainment, and recreation accounts for about almost 2% of total sales and use taxes in the state of Wisconsin. And one thing that we can see here is if we look at how these have changed over time, we can see that sales and use tax collections for accommodation and food services, as well as arts, entertainment, and recreation, have been going up over time, which would make sense as the economy has strengthened coming out of the 2007 to 2009 recession. One thing I want you to really keep in mind here is how seasonal this industry is. We can see the sales tax collections here for instance, accommodation and food services peaking in the month of July, dropping down a bit in the shoulder season, picking back up around Christmas, and then similar patterns being repeated. So I think this is really important based on where we are right now. So we don't know what's going to happen going forward. We don't know how long it's going to last, how long consumer sentiment is going to stay the way it is, even if we do end some of our restrictions for social distancing. But this is a really important time because these sales tax collections are just starting to ramp up here as we go into spring and summer. For those of you who want the data for your own counties, you can actually get this as an interactive service from the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. I put the link there at the top. So if you want to go in, pick your industry and pick your time frame, you can see how much sales tax these different industries are contributing to your local economy. And I think that'll provide some perspectives for your local stakeholders if people are interested in how these downturns might impact your local economy. So here's how employment has changed over time for food services and drinking places. In this slide here, we're going back to the year 2000, and I think this is an important time period for a couple reasons. So first of all, when thinking about the hospitality, tourist, and service industry, obviously we had a recession in 2001 that impacted this industry, but we also had 9/11. And if you look at a lot of the comparisons people are making out there right now, they're trying to use 9/11 as a way to think about how the industry might respond and come back going forward. Now, I don't personally think that's necessarily a good comparison for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, it does give us some historical perspective. We also had the recessionary period here and starting in 2007, so we can also kind of see how these industries went through an economic decline and recovery based on that very strong recessionary period. So that might give us some perspectives of how this might change going forward here for these different industries as we will likely enter a fairly severe recession next quarter. So if we look at food services and drinking places and how they've changed in the United States and the state of Wisconsin, we didn't see much of a dip in the 2001 recession and after 9/11. We did see significant dips after the Great Recession. And we saw that in the United States, for instance, we saw employment in this industry sector come back in about 3 years or so. State of Wisconsin took a bit longer, about 5-year period, but we can see that we have seen strong growth over the last several years. But nonetheless, the recessionary period did have a notable impact in terms of total employment in this industry. Now, accommodations, I think, is one that's a little bit more relevant given what happened with 9/11. So we can see that accommodations in terms of total employment in the United States really started going down after 2001. And again, it took about 5 years for total employment to get back to pre-recessionary levels based on the 2001 recession and the events of 9/11. And we saw the state of Wisconsin didn't take quite as long and didn't see quite as severe of a drop. But nonetheless, if we do see a big decline in accommodations employment, which we likely will, we can see nationally how long it did take to get back here. We can also see the impacts of the 2007 recession, very steep declines in these industries. But we did see them bounce back after a while in the United States and in the state of Wisconsin. But again, the state of Wisconsin taking a bit longer to rebound than the national average. Other industries, we can see museums, historical sites, and similar institutions. Not quite the dips that we saw with the other industries in the 07 recession and in the 2001 period, post-2001 period. We see strong growth here after the Great Recession, but one thing to keep in mind is that this is a fairly small industry sector in terms of total employment, so it doesn't take much to change the percentages in a short period. And then performing arts, spectator sports, and related industries, somewhat similar pattern as you saw on the prior chart with museums. Again, we see it bounce around a bit in the state of Wisconsin. We did see a decline with the 07 recession, but we've seen strong growth coming out of that with employment returning to pre-recession periods about 5 years after the start of the recession. And finally, amusement, gambling, and recreation industries, very similar patterns that we saw before, strong growth in the post-recession period, and it did take about 4 to 5 years for employment to rebound to pre-recession levels. We can also look at this industry in terms of location quotients. So those of you not familiar with location quotients, it's a measure of specialization, or it's also somewhat of a measure of export industries, whether or not you're bringing outside dollars into your local community. So the key measure here, or key number, is 1. So if you have a location quotient of 1, you have the same share of employment as the national average. So if you're below 1, you have a smaller share than the national average, and if you're above 1, you have a greater share than the national average. Values above about 1.2, 1.25 suggest that you have somewhat of a specialization in an industry, and it's export industry. You're bringing outside dollars into your state or regional economy, depending upon what geography you're using. If you look at those states that have location quotients above 1 or above 1.2, we see some of the usual suspects. We see places like Florida, Montana, Nevada, Colorado. Delaware is up there. That's simply because a lot of corporations incorporate in the state of Delaware for tax advantages. So it's not necessarily that they're doing super well in terms of their hospitality and entertainment economy. It's just that it's the tax structure in their state. We do see the state of Wisconsin is below 1, and that might surprise a lot of people on a statewide average for arts, entertainment, recreation, given how prevalent tourism is in the state of Wisconsin. But you also see other Midwestern states being somewhat similar. And then a lot of states that you probably expect being fairly low, places like West Virginia, Oklahoma, and so on and so forth. No offense to them. But again, the statewide averages really don't capture some of the regional variations we have in the state of Wisconsin. So this is a county by county location quotient for arts, entertainment, and recreation industries. The darker the red, the greater above 1, the darker the blue, the more below 1. And if you look at the state of Wisconsin, it's probably not a big surprise where you see location quotients above 1. You see places like Door County, you see Bayfield, Vilas, Iron, the Dells area, and Sauk and Adams. You see Dane County actually being a little bit above 1. So again, these aren't big surprises. We do see a lot of other counties in the state that are below 1, however, that might surprise people that aren't very familiar with this industry. And again, we see those large concentrations in states we noted earlier. We see the Front Range of Colorado. We see the Rocky Mountain area of Montana. We see the areas around Yellowstone in Wyoming, and so on and so forth. So again, statewide, our numbers are somewhat surprising, below 1, but we do see these regional concentrations. We can also do this for accommodation and food services, similar chart as we saw before. Here we are a little bit closer to 1, and this is what you'd probably expect. You'd expect a lot of states being close to 1, because this is an industry, in terms of food service anyway, that's not just driven by visitors, it's also driven by local consumption. So we'd expect many of these industries, or many of these states, excuse me, to be fairly close to 1 for food services anyway. And we look again, we see many of those same states we saw in the previous chart being high. We see Nevada with Las Vegas, we see Wyoming, Montana, Florida. South Carolina is actually a little surprising, but they do have Hilton Head and other tourist destinations there that probably inflate those numbers somewhat. And again, many states that we saw before on the previous chart being somewhat lower in terms of location quotients. But again, none of them are very low. Most of them are 0.75 or above. And again, if we look at this regionally, we can see a somewhat similar pattern as we saw before, but we do see some other counties pop out here in terms of location quotients above 1. We see Oneida County now, which we didn't see on the prior map. We also see Sawyer County. We see Florence County. It's stuck in my head. We do see a lot of counties that have a 4-year UW institution as well. So we see Eau Claire, we see Portage County, we see La Crosse County. We also see Pepin County pop up as a location quotient above 1. And again, we see some of those concentrations across the United States that we saw on the prior map as well. So again, long story short is that statewide, we do see location quotients for both these industries somewhat below 1, but as we all know, we have these regional concentrations that are very dependent upon hospitality and tourism industries. We can also look at this more locally in terms of total employment, not just looking at it from a national perspective, but trying to put a little bit more nuance on it in terms of what distributions look like just in the state of Wisconsin. So the map you see on your left there is arts, entertainment, recreation employment as a share of total county employment, and then overall total employment on that map on your right. And as you would expect, more populous counties tend to have greater employment in this industry, which it wouldn't surprise everyone. But we do see many counties, such as Vilas, Oneida, Iron, Bayfield, Douglas, and so on and so forth, that have a high share, relatively speaking, of total employment in these industries. Same concept with accommodation and food service employment by county. Again, more populous counties, as you would expect, have greater absolute numbers of employees. Our tourism regions of the state have greater dependence in terms of the total share of employment in accommodation and food services. So another way we can consider the tourism service economy is to think about it in terms of occupations that work in these industries. And one of the things I added to these numbers was to look at what's called a work context from what's known as ONET. And ONET is a way to look at every occupation in the country and break it down in terms of the different skills and requirements needed by that occupation. And I think one that's really important now, given our social distancing measures, is physical proximity. So what ONET has done is look at all these different occupations and rank them from 100 to 0. So a 0 being I don't work near other people really at all, so beyond 100 feet away, and then those that are very close, so up to 100, and then 75 would be moderate, which would be at arm's length. And if we look at occupations that are most prevalent in arts, entertainment, and recreation, we can certainly see that many of those require very close physical proximity. So what is being done now in terms of shuttering some of those industries temporarily does make a lot of sense for both the customers, but also the people that work in those industries as well. We see the top 15 occupations here. So we see things like amusement, recreation attendants, bartenders, coaches and scouts, waiters and waitresses, security guards, and so on and so forth. One thing to keep in mind here is that this table really echoes what we saw in the share of total wages counted for by this industry. So most annual average wage for these common occupations in arts, entertainment, and recreation tend to be below the state average and usually range between $20,000 and $35,000 a year. So many of the people that work in these industries are somewhat lower income and lower earnings. Some of them may work more than one job. Some of them may be a spouse of individuals that have a different job that's a little bit higher earning. But nonetheless, these are people being impacted by this that in a lot of instances are not making a large annual average wage in these occupations. Very similar pattern for accommodation and food services. We do see some overlap in occupations that are common in both these industries, but we do see some different ones here as well. Again, many of them have low annual average wages due to their part-time nature, and a lot of them do require high levels of physical proximity. If we look at this, these two industries in terms of their total employment by different age groups, oftentimes we think of these industries as being staffed by high school students or college students, and this is somewhat true compared to the overall distribution by age for all industries. We do see higher shares of individuals in both accommodation, food services, and arts, entertainment, and recreation that are under the age of 19 or ages 19 to 24. But a very large share of them are in the prime working ages of 25 to 54. And then we do also see a higher share of individuals aged 65 or older for arts, entertainment, and recreation, the state average for all industries. We can also see how this distribution is changing over time. We can see the share of individuals aged 55 or older going back to 1990 up to the end of 2018. We can see that the share of individuals age 55 or older are obviously increasing across all industries, but we do see it almost doubling in accommodation and food services. And then within accommodation, or excuse me, within arts, entertainment, and recreation, we see it very close to the state average now as well. We can also see the seasonality, again, come into play here. We see a lower share of individuals that are age 55 or older in the summer, and then a higher share in the shoulder seasons and the winter. So again, this changes a lot over different parts of the year, but nonetheless, we do see that these industries are growing more dependent on older individuals. So one thing that I think a lot of us are struggling with is what is the overall economic impact of declines in revenue to these industries? And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. And Steve Deller, I think Steve was on the line earlier. We've kind of gone back and forth a little bit in terms of the proper ways to model this. So these are in no way supposed to be kind of absolute numbers, but these are just kind of trying to give you a range of estimates of what drops might look like based on different scenarios. So here I simply chose declines in employment based on a 10% drop in revenue, a 20% drop in revenue, and a 30% drop in revenue. And you can see the direct, indirect, and induced impacts of those scenarios on these different industries. So for instance, with accommodation food service, if we do see a decline of 30% in revenues for that industry, that will account for almost 120,000 jobs in the state of Wisconsin. And again, if you're not familiar with the direct, indirect, and induced effects, the direct is the absolute loss within the industry itself. The indirect is a loss based on impacts within the supply chain, the buy-sell relationships from this industry and other industries. And the induced is the loss employment due to declines of household spending. We can also do this in terms of labor in similar scenarios, similar patterns you saw before. But again, if we see a 30% drop in accommodation food service revenue, we see a loss in labor income of about $3.5 billion in the state of Wisconsin. The other question is whether these impacts will have significant kind of effects within other parts of the economy. So this is just broadly looking at the demand for goods and services from accommodation and food services. This is the kind of buy-sell relationships that they have. So this industry in the state of Wisconsin purchases almost $1 billion from other real estate services, about $1 billion from management, accompanying enterprise within the state of Wisconsin, and so on and so forth. The question is, how do these impacts trickle down throughout the economy within these other industries? One of the fears I really have is because so many of these industries occupy our main streets, they occupy a lot of our commercial real estate. If we do see significant impacts in the short term, what does this mean for the real estate market going forward? Now, those are, again, just some really broad scenarios of what might happen. But the question is, what are really the net impacts? So we will see some shifts in demand. We're already seeing it. We're seeing people obviously spending less on food away from home, but they're spending more in grocery stores. They're spending more online. I was just telling Kristen, I saw that demand for computer monitors and peripherals are going up now because of people working at home. And we saw these shifts in purchasing patterns, for instance, for food at home and food away from home over the last several decades. We saw that food away from home actually overtook spending of food at home a few years ago, and they're about a parity now. But how does this swing back and impact other sectors that may see increases in revenues and may see increases in jobs? The other question here is that if we shift from food away from home, which is taxable, to food at home, which many times is not taxable, how does it impact sales tax collections as well? So again, these are some of the issues we're trying to work through, and we really don't have good answers to quite yet. The other question I think that a lot of places throughout the state of Wisconsin will have to consider is that what does this mean for visitors in terms of seasonal recreation and occasional housing units that are very prevalent in parts of the state of Wisconsin. You see several counties in northern Wisconsin that have over 40% of their housing units designated as seasonal recreational use. And some of those counties are within the top 100 counties in terms of total seasonal recreational housing units in the entire country. We've already heard places like Door County and Vilas County and Oneida County telling people that they want them to stay away from the time being, but how long does this happen? How long does this continue going forward, and what does that mean for revenues from this consumer segment in many of our Wisconsin counties? So I guess my big question to all of you is, what are our next steps? We can see that this is a very important part of our economy in many parts of the state, and some parts of the state more so than others. But how do we respond as an institution? Is it simply educating businesses in terms of what types of resources are out there in response to the CARE Act, or are there other ways that we can help them work through this process? What other questions should we be asking? What questions might you be hearing in your counties that we might be able to help answer with data or analysis? So with that, I just want to kind of leave it open and have a discussion in terms of what might be helpful from your perspectives.
Thank you, Matt. The floor is open for questions, and everyone should be able to unmute their microphone. If you're not, send me a note and I'll fix whatever setting I've got.
So Matt, this is Miles in Oneida County, and I happened to talk with a couple people in Three Lakes, which is very seasonal. It's not as high tourist as Minocqua, so I'm curious to talk with some people there. As a small business owner, freaked out. The library, the librarian, the librarian's having to put people on furlough. If people don't come back to their summer homes at the usual time and start buying at the grocery store, go out for coffee, etc. And these are small businesses. They aren't employing many people. So I'm looking at, and often part-time and seasonal. So I'm wondering where those seasonal part-time people fit into these sorts of numbers, and sole proprietor, how that fits in. Because, this is one example of a very seasonal recreation tourist town that, their whole downtown could go. And their town board has canceled everything through July, which is exceptional. No 4th of July parade. Well, there goes local as well as, other tourists, just gone. So, if they lose 1/3 of the summer, maybe they can make it. If they lose 2/3 of the summer, they aren't going to make it. And that's without fully understanding the small business stuff and the relief package. But help me figure out what that reality may be.
And, Miles, we can run some different scenarios too. This is really tough because, like I mentioned, we've never faced anything like this before in the last 100 years anyway. And what we're facing now, even compared to what happened with the flu in 1918, is much different in terms of how the economy operates. So, we certainly can't give you an absolute answer, but hopefully we can give you a range of answers that maybe local leaders can make some assumptions from, or maybe base some policy on.
Bill here. Miles, the one thing that I would suggest is that they need to be working with WEDC and the Small Business Administration to make sure that they're taking advantage of all the programs that are out there. One of the concerns that's there is that some of the larger businesses probably have the human capital and expertise to take advantage of these programs. The smaller businesses don't have that expertise. And I think a role for us, and this is a role that I think WDC is trying to take on, is to try to help facilitate those small businesses applying for those grants and those loans. And I think the best thing that we can do is to try to facilitate that conversation and make sure that they don't feel as though they're kind of sitting out on their own, sitting in their home, self-isolated, saying, the world is burning and I can't do anything. Well, there are these programs that are available, but it's going to be a challenge for a lot of these smaller businesses to tap into that. And I think that's a role that we can do.
And the smaller banks.
This is Kelly in Bayfield County. I wanted to echo that as an option. We're doing we've asked our SBDC person to we're hosting a Zoom so that he can talk directly to small business owners and help them walk through the EIDL and the PPP programs that are out there. But I think just seeing some Facebook comments in the local area of people being like, I don't even know where to start. It's just small business owners are so taxed. So I think that is one role that we can play. The other one that I'm interested in is in one of our local towns has decided to convert their their Main Street revolving loan fund to be more of a business help fund for the moment. And so I guess I'm interested in some other kind of maybe some innovative funding mechanisms, because I think there is a concern that some of our tiniest businesses, I think there's sort of this mentality that we never get a chunk of the pie. It just doesn't filter. And so I think that would be also some helpful potential resources on some other innovative ways that maybe creating some local funds or repurposing some other kinds of funds that might be. The other one that's been sort of popping into my mind is this might be, which isn't ideal for businesses, but they may need to take on equity partners or do some other kind of ways to shore up, as opposed to taking out more loans, because most small businesses are really leveraged, particularly this time of year. So I guess that's one thing I'd be interested from the brain trust that is the EDA, is maybe some other options that might percolate for when these bigger programs aren't perhaps going to serve everybody's needs.
You have to remember that a lot of the CARE loans, they're being put out as loans, but they're actually being written in such a way that there's going to be a lot of forgiveness, which means that they're really not a loan, they're a grant. They would like you to pay it back, but if you can't pay it back, it kind of transitions into almost like a grant.
This is Brian. I've already been involved in facilitating some discussions at a local level here in that process. And one of the things that we're seeing through I believe it's the Treasury, that you're going to have to prove that I think it's up to 90% of your employees are still on the books for that forgiveness also. So even some of this little detail stuff is going to be important for us to kind of really go through the weeds with individuals. And there's already up in my area a lot of this being moved forward already. And they've already started the process of data collection that it's needed for that process.
So, Matt, I thought I might chime in with a few comments here, but tack on to what Brian and Kelly have said. But besides some of those comments that have been mentioned by Steve and others with respect to the SBA, and even the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation is referring a lot of small businesses to the new SBA financial, what are they calling it, disaster assistance loans. But in Vilas County, also yesterday, the Economic Development Corporation did have a Skype. I almost said a Zoom, but a Skype that had more than 100 people on it. A lot of them calling in to listen to that one, and they had the state representative. They had Jim Rosenberg, who's our representative up here from the Wisconsin Economic Development. They had somebody from UW Stevens Point Small Business Development Center, and a local banker who's very involved with the businesses. And all of these matter quite a bit. And I want to note Kelly's comment of certainly the Main Street program, the revitalization program, especially we have some money set aside for facade improvements. What a time to change some of the direction of some of that money. But in Vilas 2 years ago, I guess people like me were part of this, helping to create a revolving loan fund for businesses in Vilas County that seem to, the very small ones who fall between the cracks and are so often requesting $10,000 to $15,000 in assistance. And we're now changing the direction of that $200,000 with the help of the county supervisors. It's not official yet, but we're in the process of doing that to be emergency response to the COVID situation. And I'll add one more thing, Matt. In Vilas County, food service and accommodations is the #1 occupation. More people are employed in that one in Vilas than anything else. Out of all and that one, and I'm going to look at your Department of Revenue, because what you had was such terrific information. My source for that was the DWD, the Workforce Development. Of course, their database is EMSI, which I think Bill works with it. But they're also, out of the 16 occupations listed, not only the largest in Vilas, but they're the lowest paid by far. And I even presented that to our civil rights people 3 weeks ago. That was the biggest concern because of the incredible inequality of that up here. We've got quite a few millionaires, frankly, who retire up here and come to these lakes. So that's the difference. So all of these things and how to help out. And right now we have as we spoke about this yesterday with Brandon on a Zoom line, we have the conundrum that we have I guess I call it a bumper crop of people up here from the Chicago area and from southern Wisconsin here that are giving our local businesses a boost that in some cases might otherwise be shut down this time of year because it's so slow up here. So I, as a quick example, had the of a local grocery store, Pick and Save, we go to tell me about 10 days ago they were doing July sales in March because of all the people coming up from southern Wisconsin. Yet at the same time, we have 3 COVID cases right here in the hospital here, and you know that's the dilemma that's presented here. And so that's the situation we're in right now in Vilas County and in some of the North Woods.
Chris, question: are you saying that folks are deciding to self-isolate in their summer homes?
Well, so, I have no doubt that, yeah, many are. Many are. In fact, the way that I found out, I didn't know any of this phenomenon was going on. And on the first official day, I guess, that we were telecommuting, which was St. Patrick's Day, so the 17th, so 2 weeks ago, I decided to start calling a few local businesses, specifically food service businesses, people that I already know in the Eagle River to start off, and then a few that I don't. But many of them, well, all of them actually, were telling me that, hey, we've got a whole lot of people up here from Illinois and southern Wisconsin right now, and we're doing a pretty good business. And I was quite surprised. I said, you're kidding me. And then I would call another one and they would confirm it. In fact, I actually informed our local Eagle River Chamber of Commerce director, gave her a quick call there, and it was news to her. She didn't know that, and went down to, it's not always the best time to go to the grocery store for a visit, but went down to our local Pick and Save and know the management team there and talked with them, and they said that, yeah, last Friday, meaning the 13th, we were doing, and through the weekend, we were doing July sales in March. So that was that's the conundrum that we're in right now up here. Many seasonal homeowners are here. They're giving our businesses a boost at a time, and yet there's some concern about the health department. Our discussion yesterday was that the health department in Vilas was very blunt when they came out with their warning about 10 or 12 days ago that said, in effect, stay away. It was so blunt, I was surprised, and that was part of our discussion yesterday.
Chris, you've seen that happen.
This is Brian.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Well, no, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, you've seen this in many other places across the country too. You saw it on Long Island. You've seen it with some of the checkpoints in Florida and what you're seeing in Rhode Island and Maine as well. So it's not necessarily unique to Vilas, but it is a somewhat unique problem for places like Vilas County that do depend on second homeowners.
I guess I just have a comment or a question or maybe something for a thought. You know, we're talking about what's going on right now and things that we can do to assist. But I'd like to hear sort of a discussion on strategies of what we can do kind of moving into another phase of this, say a month or 2 or 3, what we can be doing from a programmatic side to assist in this situation.
For me personally, I think part of it is just staying up with the data. You know, we don't have a lot of really good real-time data, but there are some sources out there that we can compile and help people understand what is in fact going on, whether it's initial unemployment insurance claims, whether it's mass layoffs, you know, other things like that, at least to give people a sense of how we're trending. There may be some other kind of leading or initial indicators that we can track. I don't know that for sure, but it might be something we can at least provide for now to give people a sense of the direction we're heading. Just one idea.
I'm wondering if you've looked at the smaller cities that have other UW campuses, 4-year campuses in them, and how the lack of students returning home after spring break might be affecting those communities.
That's a good question. You know, you could certainly do some modeling in terms of potential spending patterns to see how that might influence local businesses, but it's something I have not personally looked at yet.
I've been hearing that it's been quite significant in some college towns where the property owners that own apartment buildings don't know if they're going to be able to collect their last quarter rent from the students.
Did I see Steve Chmielewski on here? I recall a conversation about UW Whitewater and its relationship with some essential services like grocery stores to the community of Whitewater. I'm probably putting him on the spot if he's on the call.
Right. Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, but we talked about a couple of weeks ago, excuse me, how it was kind of what did we call it? A inverse seasonal effect going on there. When the college students and families are gone in summer and winter, there's a lot of business operators taking a hit. There's a lot of dependence on the UW community there. And so they're adjusting right now. Some have, made decisions pretty quick. So we're just kind of waiting and seeing and working with the SBDC on campus. But yeah, that's an issue for a number of companies that are highly dependent on students. So it's interesting times right now.
Matt, can you
A
hear me?
little bit closer to home. The UW-Madison is going to start refunding students fees and dorm rentals, and it's looking like it's going to cost the campus close to $100 million. If the other campuses do the same thing, that's going to be a big financial hit to the UW system, and how the system pays for that could, I mean, while the Division of Extension doesn't have resident instruction responsibilities, Extension is probably going to be asked to pony up some money to help cover to pay for those refunds.
Steve, I think I saw it was about 3% of the budget.
For UW-Madison, it's about 3% of the budget, but when you get into campuses like Whitewater, Stevens Point, Plantville, you're talking upwards of 50%. Well, the tuition and fees is 50% of their budget. So I think Madison is better positioned to absorb some of it, but some of the other campuses, it's going to be a real hit for them. And how the system figures out how they're going to pay for that, this could be yet further tight times in the near future. Isn't that optimistic?
Sherry. Oh, this is Sherry. I had a question about how we might look at this longer term. From what I've been seeing, it's predicted that in September, we're going to have another spike, so that we might get over this, let's say at the end of May, beginning of June, but then there could be a recurrence of the virus in the fall. So I'm also thinking that as you're planning and looking at things, kind of looking at strategies of how maybe to deal with that.
And I guess that's where I was going with my comment is that we know kind of what's going on now. We know there's tools out there that we can look and assist and get community involved in that kind of thing. But what are we going to do from that point on, and with other things that can happen in, like as being said, September, etc.? What are some of the strategies as a group can we start looking at to maybe be sort of the head of the game as best as we can?
That's a great question.
Not everybody go quiet.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. It's also a daunting question. What would be some of the basic tools and people we would need to bring in? And reflecting on some of what's been said over the last 10 minutes and thinking, should we as educators ourselves have a conversation with the SBDCs and whatnot? Should we bring them on a Zoom so that we can talk about how we can amplify the tools that they have? But at 2 to 3 months out, yeah.
I know there's a number of Asian countries that, there's certainly different dynamics to those countries, but a number of them are sort of slowly opening up commerce and activity again. South Korea, Shanghai, Taiwan. And so there might be something to see what are the strategies that are being utilized in those cultures and in those communities to, because from my understanding is it's slow going, meaning that people understandably so are very nervous about returning to life as normal, and they're not being asked to, but there are strategies, and slowly but surely you see people to sort of return to going out for coffee, going out for going to the gym and so forth. So maybe there's something we can learn from cultures that are ahead of us in terms of the curve and how they're managing having people return, with the idea that there could very well be an additional spike even after we get past this first wave.
I think to piggyback on what Brandon's just saying too, like that little bit of forecasting, I don't know if there's like consumer confidence numbers, like how robust things, if they return this summer, what they would look like, where people are likely to still stay away from. But wondering about any forecasting like that too, that might help us offer small businesses some ways to pivot to be more functional in whatever might come. So I'm not sure what that looks like, but is it, you know, that they need to, you know, figure out more ways to have their products online, or is it that there's, you know, that this is the moment to install a drive-through window, or like what that kind of return looks like. And I think it's a good idea, Brandon, to look at some other places that might have some relevance in being ahead.
And some organizations that are managing this well. I'm thinking of a clothing shop I know in downtown Madison that's having a daily fashion show on Instagram, and that's how they're keeping their sales receipts up. In other businesses that were able to quickly pivot to delivery of food is natural, but you know, what other products have there been that could do that? So maybe if we're starting to catalog methods that are keeping people afloat, that when that next wave hits in 2 to 3 months, or when we have a bit of perspective, we can come at people with a set of strategies.
Mm-hmm.
As well as providing some support so that if they do want online ordering or that sort of thing, that if they have no idea how to set that up, that there are people we can help send them to that could help them get rolling with that with a nominal fee, you know, not an exorbitant amount of money for an IT person to put that together for them.
I think one of the things that I think we should be looking at long term is documenting how communities have rallied together to address this crisis. I think in terms of like coming up with examples of how communities have been able to build social capital, how they've been able to reach out of their communities to tap into outside help, and kind of documenting how, you know, we can rally together, we can work as a community, we can work as a group, and kind of, you know, once kind of celebrate the success that the community rallied together, but also kind of say, look, we can keep this momentum going and build on other community initiatives. So it's an opportunity to kind of think about this in terms of a community development, as opposed to simply there's an economic crisis that we're facing. In terms of, as one of the things that Matt said is that these economic impacts, he and I have been going around with another colleague on campus here in terms of how to do these economic impacts. And it's pure guesswork right now. I mean, all we can do is put some parameters on it. There are some economists that are going around saying that the recession that we're going to go into is going to be worse than the Great Recession of 10 years ago. There are others saying that, no, we're going to be able to bounce back stronger. Right now, it's all guesswork in terms of what the economy is going to look like 6 months from now. We don't know.
Speaking of the guesswork, I guess I'm thinking of this in a little bit different lens, and that is, you know, a lot of Sauk County's revenue comes from tourist dollars out of the Dells. I mean, I'm talking about county government, and I'm wondering, and on that revenue site you sent us, is there some help for, you know, our budgeting folks that are just getting into this now to think about what some scenario planning might be? If it's a 30% drop, this is what we'll have. If it's a 10% drop, it's like this much, you know, this is where we'll be at, and just helping them think through the budgeting process for the county. Is that in that revenue website?
The Wisconsin County Association just put something out like that in the past couple of days.
And the DOR website has all sorts of reports in terms of different revenue streams too. And maybe local government center has some other resources that they are aware of that they can send along. But there are a lot of ways that we can kind of put some numbers behind that based on different, as Steve said, different parameters, but also, you know, what the revenue streams look like in the past.
Matt, a great presentation and great conversation as well. My only concern is that tourism is really an urban thing in Wisconsin. I guess 3/4 of the tourism dollars are spent in Milwaukee or Dane County. And many of those properties are big properties owned by corporations that are used to managing their properties with fixed and variable costs and knowing how to cut down when things are bad. But they're also very resilient businesses too, that when things get better, they turn on the switch and their employees are coming back and their fixed costs are under control. So I think we have to give some credit to the sophistication of the industry. It's more than just individuals struggling, looking for help. There are some successful businesses as well. A lot of large chains are doing some good things, and we'll be ready to respond when things get better. A little bit of hope for us.
I wonder too if some of the tourism is going to be more staycation for a while, where although traveling is involved when people are going to northern Wisconsin or elsewhere in the state, it's not going to be probably looked at the same as hopping on a plane and going elsewhere in the world, right? So we may actually come out ahead of the game. And when you're thinking about that, are there reassurances that the businesses could be putting into place related to cleanliness and, you know, ensuring there's hand sanitizer when people walk into their establishment, just to reassure people that it's okay to come there? Or is that not a scope that we would want to work?
I think it's something we should look at. And if I don't have any data in front of me to verify this right now, but I remember during that recession, 2010, that, you know, we had a feeling that things were going to be a little iffy up here. But because of that, you know, the dollars were tight. I think there's a lot of people coming to the northern Wisconsin because of those things, that it's a little less expensive to do that than go, you know, 5-6 states over. So there might be some opportunity in those situations also.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I'm curious about, you know, I know we're in uncharted territory, but based on the last recession and then also following September 11th, there were, in an odd way, these places, especially up in the northern part of the state, the lows weren't as low as other parts of the country, and the highs, just like when we go through this major growth period, the highs aren't as high. And so I'm wondering if there's some sort of buffer that's going to be just naturally tied into the fact that there isn't as much. I mean, I think something Kelly had talked about is a little disconcerting and is worrisome to me, and Miles had mentioned this as well, is when you have these anchor places in these small towns that are like the coffee shop or the grocery store that everyone goes to, if that goes out of business, that could be really a game changer, or at least for the feel in the community. And when you shut down the stream of people, not just tourists, but everyone that's in that community going to those places, I don't know how much capital they have saved up to be able to make it through prolonged, zero. So that's a little worrisome, and that seems like a different example from the past. So I'm just curious if there's anything we can sort of glean from past challenges that might suggest that, you know, it might not be as doom and gloom in some of these areas it might seem when you first look at it.
I'm also wondering if anyone's contacted or heard from the Department of Tourism. You know, we hear from WDC and we've heard a little bit from DWD, but Department of Tourism has GEM grants, they have other things like that. I wonder if they've thought about shifting some of their priorities going forward in terms of how they distribute their grant funds.
I've been getting fairly regular emails from tourism, and I'll talk to Drew Nussbaum to see if he or somebody else there wouldn't mind doing a Zoom with us. Natalie Chin, who is with us today from Sea Grant, also posted a link in the chat of an extension program or a program through Sea Grant Extension and some tourism colleagues, a link to register for a seminar, Adapting Extension Tourism Programming for COVID-19, on Thursday, April 23rd at 1 o'clock. I'll circulate that via email after we're all off today, but I wanted to call attention to that because that might answer some of the questions. I have a punch list here of people that I'm going to try to get in contact with on behalf of some of the conversations that we've got, including the SBA. We partner with Mark Lane quite a lot. Maybe he'll want to talk more formally with us as a large group. He's always open to talking with us. Second, tourism. If there's anybody else that people would like information from, feel free to reach out for yourself, but also send me an email and I'll try to get in contact with as many as I can. But with that, we're at 1 o'clock. Anybody that wants to continue having the conversation is welcome to stay on board. This is all I have planned for the rest of the afternoon for meetings, so I can stay Zooming forever. If not, thank you for joining us. Keep the conversation going and let's see what we can do here.
I just wanted to add, if you guys don't mind for a second, that a lot of the revenue that was going to come into rural areas, especially in Wisconsin, was going to come from large solar developments, utility scale solar developments. And because of the supply chain issues, where a lot of either the panels come from China, the racking metals come from India, et cetera, they've been declaring force majeure. And so what's happened is the projects aren't going away, but they're being delayed. And we don't know how long those delays will be, but likely a year or two. So this was a huge amount of money, probably more than all business or ag was bringing into the counties and to some of the smaller municipalities from these projects. And that also should be taken into account in the budgeting. Didn't want to add more bad news, but it's a reality.
That's one of the struggles that Matt and I had trying to figure out how to do an economic impact of the virus, because we don't know how many manufacturers have shut down because their supply chain has been disrupted, or they're shutting down because this distancing thing. We really don't know. We won't be able to know that the full economic impact of this thing for at least a year, if not 2 years. Because the supply chains have been disrupted so much, not only coming in but also shipping out. Some on the ag side, some of the folks are very concerned that we simply cannot ship a lot of our exports out of the country because the ports are shut down. And how that all plays out, that's why a lot of this is guesswork.
I wonder if it has some implication in the lending market for hotels. There's been a lot of new hotel supply built in recent years, and with fresh debt service on those properties. And you kind of wonder what's going to happen to real estate when this pans out in a few months, without businesses being able to generate the cash flow to pay off their mortgage on their new hotels. So there might be a real estate issue here as well.
It'll definitely put a crimp on our workforce housing issues.
Yeah.
The wealthy will be able to buy, and this will be a great opportunity for people with piles of money. But for people to actually work here and provide the services that they want, not to mention volunteer fire departments and first responders, it's going to be a whole new world here. And I think, Steve, I share your economist optimism. Certainly we won't know for a year until it's over, until the initial freak out is past, where we're at and where to go. But I also really like Brian continuing to remind us we have to look at what may be possible. Where do we want to go? So, we don't know where we will be, but when we're there, which direction do we want to be going? And that's not an easy straight line numbers, simple thing to do. But there's a lot of creative, smart people here.
Add to what Bill said, there are a lot of landlords, people who own houses or own apartment buildings, who, because of the emergency rule or order that the governor put in, they can't evict people if they're not paying rent. But if they're not getting rents, how are they paying their own bills, and what's going to happen to those buildings? And so I think that's another, impact in the commercial real estate that we might not be thinking about, but those people, they need money too, and their mortgages are due on the rental properties that they own.
Maybe a suggestion is, and this goes back to Brian, and Brian, I think you said this yesterday as well when we were meeting, but I mean, sort of thinking about, there's the immediate response, which I think a lot of us are doing or trying to do, to say walking small businesses through SBA loan processes and so on and so forth. But then thinking, you know, a month, 2 months down the road, a lot of the questions and conversations that are currently being had is more about thinking, forecasting, so to speak, what could be coming down the pike, and can we be there and ready to assist in that process. And it sounds like bringing together, and I know we're all zoomed out and we have a lot of things going on, so, but maybe bringing together a group of folks to start thinking about some of these topics and coming up with strategies might be a good use of our time. You know, we've talked about looking at what other communities are doing in terms of responding as they get out of, after they kind of come down from the peak. We've talked about responses in the midst, and if it's prolonged, like what can businesses do as a response? So do you do drive up? Do you do online? And I just saw something I can't remember what the consortium is, but it's a business network that is actually looking to get Governor Evers to allow for delivery of alcohol to homes as and be considered an essential business. So thinking about, yeah. So there's a lot of things, and there was, you know, other stories of, it's the giant bookseller in the Seattle area that ended up opening up appointments once that they had shut down, and then they started going by appointment only. And then they had to bring more people back on because online book sales had went through the roof. And so there's a number of strategies that we could probably start pulling together, coalescing, and then sharing with state partners. And I think if there are interested people, we could start having those conversations, start moving some of that ahead.
And I know after the 08 recession and with the floods in 08 as well, a lot of us started to dig into the community resiliency literature as well. Laura Brown did a lot around that for a while. I wonder if it makes sense to kind of go back and dig up some of the work that was done there before. I'm sorry, Tess, I didn't mean to jump on your comment.
Yeah, nothing new to say, just that I think that a lot of us are alluding to that there will be a new normal, that I don't, you know, perhaps, and this is my personal opinion, probably more than my professional opinion, but to help businesses maybe think about not how things will get back to normal in terms of the way they were before, but there might be a new normal that involves more online shopping and that involves more grocery delivery. And I expect that the behavioral changes that this is producing will be slow to wear off. So just helping businesses think about that kind of new pathway.
And as a geographer, I'm really interested going forward how this interrupts things like agglomeration economies, how it changes supply chains, just to the geographic distribution of economic activity in general. You know, a lot of people asked very similar questions after 9/11. Some came to fruition, some didn't. But I think a lot of us should be thinking about some of these changes and what they might mean going forward.
On the resiliency work, the one thing that keeps coming back again and again and again, particularly after like a natural disaster, is the social capital of the community, the ability of the community to rally together, to work together, to kind of have a proactive attitude is really important. The other question I'd like to ask folks to kind of think about is broadband. It's starting to get a little bit of attention here in the Madison area, particularly related to students that don't have access to broadband. And all the telecommuting and whatnot. So if there's something, I think long-term, is that we could use this, we should never pass up a good crisis. I think that this is an opportunity to kind of say how broadband has become necessary. We can't just treat it as a luxury. We have to make a major public investment in broadband. And this is an example of why we have to do that now.
And if I may add to that, I think it also has to be a dialogue about the affordability of it. Because, you know, somebody can say, yeah, we can run infrastructure out to certain areas, but it's going to cost you. And those same individuals that would have to pay for that are the same individuals that are hurting the worst right now. So that's something to kind of keep in mind in those discussions. In fact,
You're right.
when you talk about broadband, I'm looking at over in my living room where I'm trying to, with Tony Roman's help, figure out how my hotspot can get a little bit better signal. So I have 2 soup cans taped together, stuck over the antenna, so we can try to magnify the connection. So when you talk about broadband, I get a little worked up over that.
That reminds me of the days of having the rabbit ears on the TV and getting the piece of aluminum foil on the rabbit ears. Exactly. I thought we were beyond that. Obviously
we
not.
still have that going in a bedroom upstairs. We have the rabbit ears with foil, quite honestly.
And yet
I am
sitting here
wondering
with
some of these larger programs like broadband, should we be somehow cataloging them so that we can share our thoughts with legislators in case they're going to do, well, they're likely to do more stimulus type bills, right? So should we have our wish list put together to share with senators and Congress people?
Yes, I think that's an excellent idea. I also think collecting stories of how it's not working, because the general story is that these broadband grants are going out. Well, what the service providers are doing is using it to invest in existing infrastructure, going from, say, 3G to 4G to 5G, and they're still not investing in new infrastructure. I mean, in terms of reaching out to more people, they're kind of trying to improve the quality of services of their current customer base, as opposed to growing their customer base. And Brian, you're perfectly right. It doesn't make sense for them to run these lines because the expense just it doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's the principle that they wired the nation for telephone wires almost 100 years ago. My grandparents were able to make a long distance phone call once a month because the FCC required, or what was the FCC then, required that in order to provide service at all, they had to wire everybody. We're missing that element of legislation with broadband. Yeah. But an effective list of complainers is I think always a useful thing. I've got an email from a Dodge County supervisor this morning about broadband issues that they're having and they've been trying to deal with. So if we can compile kind of those, folks that will help us make the argument when the time comes, that's great too.
Yeah, I would like to be chatting with Gail and all of you. I'm seeing a number of you who are thinking about this. I think Chris Stark left this conversation to go have one about broadband. So I'm not quite sure how to organize ourselves, but we'll be talking about this at next week's Lunch and Learn. So bring your stories, your complaints about how it's not working, your success stories of what is next week. And maybe we can come up with a way to compile those and organize ourselves to make a compelling argument.
So for what it's worth, also I think, Sherry, a while ago, you and I had a conversation about potential opportunities for energy efficiency in the government, like local government and municipalities, and how that had economic impacts. And I think, in this conversation, we've seen a number of ways where the economics at the county level and in municipalities is really that's going to have a pretty big impact, and they were already struggling. And so I think, like, longer term, also looking at this as an opportunity for potential ways to make some changes that could have positive impacts on some of those budgets. I think thinking about opportunities overall is really good.
In terms of the hospitality discussion, this is America. America's people are out to be entrepreneurial and make money, and things are going to return. I think it's a resilient economy in tourism, and people are going to want to meet again and travel again and have functions again. And so I'm optimistic about it based on my bias from the hotel industry.
Well, and Diana just posted in the chat the point that a lot of immigrant business owners will be reluctant to apply for stuff, even if their immigration status is secure and all that stuff, I imagine is related to it, but cultural reasons as well, like the cultural reasons of the bullheadedly independent, self-reliant Northwoods people. Anyway, thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome.
Very good.
Okay.
We'll keep you busy, Matt.
All right, thank you. With that, this will be up on the CCED Lunch and Learn portion of the website, probably by tomorrow afternoon, morning after at the very latest. Feel free to reach out and let's keep talking. See you guys next week, same bat time, same bat place, to talk about broadband.